Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Joe Lamack and Steve Webb and everyone at the Center for Mark Twain Studies for this remarkable opportunity to be here now. As I'm certain that many of you have heard repeatedly since its inception, there's really nothing like this center, this program, the opportunity of which really invites one to think about what it means to truly be present with a great American author. Not to mention the remarkable and nourishing environment of the town of Elmira, with its abilities to write, read, and consult these scholarly works. If only Samuel Clemens could now visit the small windowless office in my basement in California where I write about him so often. That's my only joke, by the way. Sorry. I assumed that in the spirit of Twain there would be probably lots of jokes at these lectures, but unfortunately my material is not so funny. Thank you also to the Chemung County Historical Society for this invitation, for hosting this important forum on Twain then and now. And most especially thank you all for being here. This is my first non-Zoom presentation that I've given since the onset of this continuing global pandemic. So I will beg your patience and also invite your antagonism. If I'm ever moving too slow or too fast through a point, if I'm talking too softly or too loudly, please don't hesitate to wave your hands or yell or throw something not so hard in my direction, and we can pause and reset. So my official title at my home university is Associate Professor of Environmental Literature, and people often ask me what that actually means. While the area of study is vast and sometimes discordant, my own interests lie in a term referred to most frequently by geologists as the Anthropocene, or that proposed geologic epoch in which human activity has become the dominant force in shaping conditions for life on Earth. Let's see if I can use this here. I'll go through these terms here in a minute that frame a portion of my talk.
I hope there's no quiz afterwards.
No quiz, no quiz. I hope you won't quiz me afterwards. Teaching in the humanities, I'm particularly interested in the question of what it means to be human at a time when the consequences of anthropogenic environmental change may require us to radically reinvent ourselves if we are to survive as a species. Of course, there are many ways to be human in this current... There are many ways to be human. And this existential crisis was not generated by all manner of knowing and being in the world. I'm okay to read in the dark for a moment. I'll let you know. I have a kind of a nice light right here.
Move the lectern closer to the...
Oh yes, yeah. Well, we can
you might
always
get the more light just from the...
You know, this is perfect for now, and I'll raise my hand or shout if it becomes a problem. Far from a uniform and uncontested continuation of Enlightenment thought, one which privileged René Descartes' famous dualities of the mind as apart from the body, as nature as apart from culture, 19th century America was flush with diverse and oftentimes divergent epistemologies, or bodies of knowledge, about the human in our entangled environments, arriving and competing at the intersections of migration and diaspora, displacement and settlement, human enslavement and fugitive resistance. As new disciplinary currents in botany and biology, geology and biomedical science began to take hold, they would draw not only from philosophical lineages in Europe, but also inherit indigenous knowledge traditions across the hemisphere and into the Pacific archipelagos, the Caribbean basin, all of which held varying definitions of personhood and its relation to non-human ecosystems. More specifically, the book project on which I've been working for the past few years considers how certain canonical authors of the 19th century, Emerson, Twain, Melville, and Dickinson in particular, came to receive and navigate these non-European epistemologies, mindful all the while of how such unstable and ambivalent literary meditations on humanness and personhood might aid us in thinking about this present Anthropocene. Now, I'll pause here for a second And not to be either didactic or reductive, I don't know if there are philosophers in the room. My training is in literature and philosophy as opposed to literature and history. And so these are some specific terms that I'll be drawing from throughout my talk. And there are terms that have kind of informed the context in which I think about Mark Twain and his importance to environmental literature today. And so the first, as I mentioned above, is that term, the Anthropocene, which is that proposed epoch by many geologists, which is set to replace the Holocene. And some date it to 1492, others date it to the 17th century, a moment when human activity began to start to shape climate and start to shape conditions for life on Earth as the dominant force. Another term that I use throughout this talk and throughout my work is that of ontology. And again, I'll use a sort of working definition here, but we could think about that as the study of being human, what it means to know that you are human, not necessarily as an essential given, but as something that is learned and in many ways can be perhaps relearned or reconsidered in the context of its history. I use this term, which I used in the preceding paragraph, epistemology, and again, a working definition that we might consider is bodies of knowledge from which we draw to understand our world. So those could be empirical bodies, scientific bodies, secular bodies, spiritual bodies, traditional knowledges, oral histories, family stories, things that we take from when we want to understand and explain the world in which we live. And then finally, this last term, which we'll use later on in the talk, and this is about bodies and being, the title of my talk, is this long word, transcorporeality. And this is a word that is most recently introduced in the environmental humanities by the critic Stacia Limo. She writes that transcorporeality does the opposite of distancing or dividing the human from external nature. It implies that we are literally enmeshed in the physical material world. So environmentalism cannot be externalized in an optional kind of pursuit, but is always present and always at hand. So again, we could think about those words sort of trans or across within, and then bodies, the makeup of one's body. So thinking about oneself and one's embodied self as not necessarily being stable and individual, but as being deeply enmeshed and therefore responsible to the environments in which we live. So the idea that I might not be able to really think about the wholeness of my body without thinking about all of your bodies in this room, as well as the room itself and the physical space that we occupy. Okay, so we can maybe move on to Twain now. And I must admit that I came to Mark Twain very late in this project. Reflecting now, this does seem odd. From his deeply textured personas and iconographic, oft-impersonated embodiment, to his stark rhetorical and political contradictions, even his century-awaited biography, a very assault on traditions and the genre itself. Twain seems most apparent, most ripe for meditations on the instability of personhood. I must also admit that I did not come to Mark Twain through any of his more notable works, as much of an impression as they might have made on me in my undergraduate days. Rather, I came to Twain in Hawaii, both via scholarly pathways. I'd been studying Melville's literary engagement with the Pacific archipelagos, as well as personal. A few years before his death, my father-in-law, a longtime environmental justice activist in Hula, presented me with the 1975 Alfred Grove Day edition of Mark Twain's Letters from Hawaii. I know you read this kind of stuff, he told me, so I picked up a copy for you. But I wouldn't recommend it, he said. I've read a few pages, and it seems pretty racist. After many years of reading through Clement's 1866 letters to the Sacramento Union, his subsequent lecture tours, his revisions and redactions in Roughing It, his recollections and revisitations in Following the Equator, I would not disagree. As many Twain scholars have noted, despite his more famously pronounced opposition to imperialism at the end of the century, these early letters from Hawaii, or the Sandwich Islands, as Twain and other 19th century Anglophone speakers would refer to them, showcase a far more conflicted American writer, inviting us to consider, in the words of Twain scholar Amy Kaplan, how the national identity of an author so yoked with regionalism and localism was intimately dependent on and also decentered by movements of global change. As Kaplan notes, more so than any other locale, Hawaii had for Twain a much more unsettling presence, or absence, as the text that cannot be written, a location of origins that can never be recovered, a forgotten language that possessed him only at the risk of breaking down. Interestingly enough, we find these moments of breakdown most clearly marked in Twain's lyrical, often ornate depictions of Hawaiian natural landscapes and ecosystems. In my talk this evening, I hope to read through a few of these passages with you, considering the subtle movements by which Twain's preciously decorative meditations on Hawaiian landscapes often deteriorate into sometimes comical and sometimes disturbing observations on the fragility and even the incoherency of the human body and its supposedly contained, recognizable self. I ultimately hope to suggest that the Hawaiian landscapes which appear across Twain's early letters might be read as sites of challenge to 19th century colonial narratives of containment and authority. It's within these ambivalent and non-Western ecologies of Twain's writing where we see a politics in Twain that extends far beyond his more familiar satires and pointed expositions, showcasing his unusual and conflicted inheritance of native Hawaiian epistemologies in his writings about the body, the self, and its surrounding ecosystems. In the spirit of this project, I'll be pairing several passages from Twain's Hawaii letters with some contemporary visual works by Hawaiian artists asking similar questions today. This includes the image up there of Abigail Romanchuk's tract, which is inspired by the GPS tracking of conservationists serving the Waikamo'i watershed of East Maui, raising questions about the role of surveillance technology and imperial forms of mapping in environmental projects on native land. Romanchuk's deep red crisscrossed lines likewise call to longer colonial histories of testing blood quantum as a prerequisite to native land reclamation, entangling the technologies of environmental surveillance with genomic policing of indigeneity in Hawaii. I also include a photograph of Chihiro Shiota's Crossroads, which uses red wool and reproductions of late 18th century colonial maps of the Hawaiian Islands to visualize the interior eruption of the volcano Kilauea, the summiting of which, at the conclusion of his 1866 letters, Twain would describe as follows. I suppose no man ever saw Niagara for the first time without feeling disappointed. I suppose no man ever saw it the fifth time without wondering how he could ever have been so blind and stupid as to find any excuse for disappointment in the first place. I suppose that any one of nature's most celebrated wonders will always look rather insignificant to a visitor at first, but on a better acquaintance will swell and stretch out and spread abroad until it finally grows clear beyond his grasp, becomes too stupendous for his comprehension. Twain's playful suppositions about disappointment, patience, and appreciation, withheld from his 1872 retelling in Roughing It, and substituted by more picturesque and sublime renditions of the volcano, are drawn from his varied and conflicting rhetorical movements throughout these 1866 letters, where the journalist, by turn, takes his audience from long-distance views of the valleys, harbors, and mountaintops where one could, quote, see all the climes of the world at a single glance of the eye, to the enclosed, dim passageways by which the reader finds themselves, quote, buried in the forest in the midst of a rank tropical vegetation and a dense growth of trees, whose great boughs overarch the road and shut out sun and sea and everything, and leave you in a dim, shady tunnel, haunted with invisible singing birds and fragrant with the odor of flowers. This constant shift between panorama and claustrophobia leaves the reader dizzy and disoriented. Released at last upon the edge of Kilauea's bubbling crater, the climax and conclusion of Twain's letters were illumined by a fiery brightness roiling beneath the night sky. Twain exclaims, quote, here was room for the imagination to work. You could imagine those lights, the width of a continent away, and that hidden under the intervening darknesses were hills and winding rivers and weary wastes of plain and desert. And even then, the tremendous vista stretched on and on and on, to the fires and far beyond. You could not compass it. It was the idea of eternity made tangible, and the longest end of it made visible to the naked eye. Twain leaves his readers aloft in this infinite reverie, overwhelmed by the magnitude of contrasting light and darkness, ignorant of the practicalities of his descent and his subsequent return to San Francisco. Such a stark conclusion to his travel narrative might be attributed to the necessitates of correspondence journalism, whereas James Caron has noted in his extensive work on Twain's Hawaii letters, the last 8 were almost certainly written after he had returned to San Francisco, where without a regular correspondence job, Clemens necessarily mined his Hawaii experience for all of its saleable ore. Caron additionally traces these Kilauea passages to their emergence in Twain's first lecture series, following publication in the Sacramento Union, emphasizing how the ornate sublimity of these poetic depictions startled audiences and reviewers who would have otherwise only remembered Twain's comic foolery. For Caron, the poetic language of Twain's Kilauea, what he calls, following other contemporary reviewers of the 19th century, word paintings, served pragmatic purposes in distinguishing Twain as a comic lecturer who was also deft and belles lettres. I would suggest that we additionally consider such unexpected language, such startlingly abrupt conclusions in Twain's work, alongside other absences permeating some of his most critically discussed later texts, including Toni Morrison's reflection on Huckleberry Finn's, quote, withholdings at critical moments, which I once took to be deliberate evasion, stumbles even, or a writer's impatience with his or her material, I began to see as otherwise, as entrances, crevices, gaps, seductive invitations flashing the possibility of meaning, unarticulated eddies that encourage diving into the novel's undertow, the real place where writers captures readers. The evasive ending to Twain's much-anticipated letters from the Sandwich Islands begs a rereading of earlier correspondence from the Pacific, where similar crevices, gaps, seductive invitations might allow insight into Twain's conflicted imperial imagination. Twain's Hawaiian ecologies are often muddled and overgrown. They're chaotic sites of meditation on the author's vexed positions around land ownership, imperial refashionings of history, and celebrated futures of annexation. Throughout these letters, Twain struggles to create a conventional portrait of ancient Edenic islands awaiting to fulfill their manifest destiny. In his most aggressive, pointed letters on the potential for American exploitation and monopolization of Hawaiian sugarcane, Twain historicizes that, quote, the sugar product is rapidly augmenting every year, and day by day the Kanaka race is passing away. As imperial capitalist logician, Twain resolves this dilemma by introducing an argument for the importation of indentured Chinese laborers. However, Twain, the journalist, the writer, and the poet, finds a far more conflicted and a contradictory vision of the commercially fertile, occupied nation, a vision best elucidated in his narrative entangling of environmental poetics and human history. Twain drew heavily from contemporary naturalists and historians like James Jackson Jarvis, whose 1834 history of the Hawaiian or Sandwich Islands he was reading throughout his 6-month visit. Jarvis, beyond his elaboration on the topography, climate, and ecologies of the Hawaiian Islands, would circumscribe a colonial narrative wherein missionization overcame savagery and commercial exploitation marked the criteria for success and also a cause for melancholy. Jarvis cohered the still ongoing genocide of native Hawaiians as a seemingly inevitable and natural loss, inspiring sympathy but not justice. What decolonial scholar Renato Rosaldo refers to as an imperial nostalgia, which, quote, makes racial domination appear innocent and pure, so that when the so-called civilizing processes destabilize forms of life, the agents of that change experience transformations of other cultures as if they were personal losses. Twain's letters much like his subsequent writings on native and indigenous tribal nations in the United States, draws from the melancholic paradigms of such nostalgia. And as our correspondent traverses the hardened lava flows, the crumbling ruins, and dormant craters, he and his companions rifling through the objects of living Hawaiian history, we are often left to feel as if we are being told a story experienced long after the fact. Yet, beyond his mimicry of colonial histories, Twain's 1866 letters are also complicated by the proliferation of written texts coming out from the Hawaiian Kanaka literary movements of the 1860s. What contemporary Hawaiian studies scholar Ku'ualoha Ho'omana Wanui refers to as the Mo'olelo Ku'una, a widespread native storytelling and emergent publishing tradition, which, quote, countered and disrupted the settler colonial discourse of the dying, ignorant, inept native. Mo'olelo Ku'una as living text, and again, that translates directly as traditional history, but it's also representative of a literary movement that was coming out of Hawaiian writers, writing in the Hawaiian Kanaka language in the 1860s, in counter to a lot of the colonial narratives, like those posed by James Jackson Jarvis. As living texts also offer necessary alternatives to settler colonial impressions of land and ecology as separate backdrops upon which human history was performed, upsetting the tidy divisions between nature and culture in Western Enlightenment epistemologies. An example of this can be seen in the many native accountings of an unwarranted British attempt to annex the island in 1843, an episode which is recounted at length in Twain's letters, where King Kamehameha III famously proclaimed, Iwa mawe ke e o ka'aina e kapona, which roughly translates to the sovereignty of the land, or the economy of the land is sovereign. Hawaiian language scholars remind us that Kamehameha III did not seek to solidify crown authority, ke e o ke a upuni, which would mean the sovereignty of the government, but rather the vital power of the land, ke e o ka'aina. And I'll pause here for a second. Some of this work comes from the Hawaiian linguist and political science scholar Nolani Goodyear Ka'apua, who really discusses sort of the importance and the impossibility of translating this word aina. And so again, Kamehameha specifically used the word aina as opposed to apua to distinguish between civil societies organized by a government or a collective social contract and organized through the land. And here, aina doesn't just mean land, but we might translate it, for instance, in English to something like autochthonous, or coming up out of the land, rising out of the land, but yet being inseparable from it. So the notion that a social contract is inseparable from the land out of which it's arisen. So for instance, if you do not belong to that specific land anymore, those specific rocks and trees and earth surrounding, that social contract would dissolve. It's what makes your ability to be community together. So that's sort of an important distinction that many Hawaiian linguists make in that term aina, which is used quite frequently. We also see that phrase by Kamehameha III, the economy of the land is sovereign, is still a remarkably popular phrase used today in native sovereignty movements. This is repeated over and over again. It was most famously repeated in 1993, which was in the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy by Ha'unani Ke Tres, a speech which was called We Are Not American, which was a very famous speech in resistance to the Hawaiian occupation. And this is an image here by a famous photographer in Hawaii, Kapulani Landgraf, which is called We Are Not American. Hey Hawaii, Ama'u, Ama'u, we are Hawaiian through and through, or we are always Hawaiian. And you can't really see it in the image, but the photographs are of 100 different Hawaiian nationalist activist leaders. And what's printed over across their faces is the phrase from Kamehameha, the economy of the land is sovereign. So Twain was not as familiar with Hawaiian linguistics, as these scholars are certainly. And while he admittedly forefronts his ignorance of the Hawaiian language, and the vast majority of the framework for his understanding of Hawaiian cultural histories relied on American missionary sources, it nevertheless behooves us to acknowledge the 1860s Hawaiian cultural landscape across which Twain traversed, as marked by emergent decolonial political and literary traditions which emphasize the interlinked relationships between human history and non-human environments. Like the tales of Comstock miners, which Twain scholars have rigorously traced to the author's unique narrative education, these mo'olelo ke ku'una, with their specific focus on the inseparability of aina and human history, are also inflected in Twain's writings, as best evidenced by his own musings on the Hawaiian landscape, so often destabilized by conflations of human corporeality and imperial history. An example of this can be seen in his most extensive narrative landscape portrait, heavily abridged in later publications, where Twain's horseback journey into the hills and valleys beyond the city of Honolulu quickly dissolves from the contained picturesque into imperial anxiety and comedic incoherence. Twain begins with a conventional account of the riding party's disorientation within the fragrant moonlit valley. He writes, "The moon rose up and flooded mountain and valley and ocean with silvery light, and I was not sorry we had lately been in trouble, because the consciousness of being safe again raised our spirits and made us more capable of enjoying the beautiful scene than we would have been otherwise. I never breathed such a soft, delicious atmosphere before, nor one as freighted with such a rich fragrance." This delicious atmosphere is quickly jolted by the revelation that Twain's riding party has been trespassing across a mass scattering of human remains along the valley floor. Rather than convey the horror of such recognition, Twain abruptly proceeds into a stilted dialogue about discovery, possession, and comedically incoherent corporeality. As the party begins collecting and hoarding individual bones, someone says, "Give me some of your bones, Miss Blank. I'll carry them for you." Another said, "You haven't got bones enough, Mrs. Blank. Here's a good shin bone if you want." Such observations as these fell from the lips of ladies with reference to their queer, newly acquired property. "Mr. Brown, will you please hold some of my bones for a minute? And Mr. Smith, you have got some of my bones, and you have got one too, Mr. Jones, and you have got my spine, Mr. Twain. Now don't any of you gentlemen get my bones mixed up with yours so that you can't tell them apart." We have a very uncomfortably, what might have been deeply comedic at the time, and yet also a highly disturbing passage. The abrupt entrance of this comic dialogue into the otherwise rich fragrance of a moonlit horseback ride allows us to read the bones as intermediating Twain's eco-poetic word painting with his anthropocentric satirizing. The bones make present, vital, and confrontational a history that was thought to be concluded and contained. The bones are both part of the landscape, albeit a seemingly intrusive part, and yet they are simultaneously human bones, muddling the clean distinction between environmental ornamentation and unadorned historical accounting, so often segregated from one another in 19th century travel narratives. Furthermore, the humor of this scene, which, like other depictions of colonial theft, was redacted from Twain's later versions in Roughing It, is driven by an anxiety about the coherency of living bodies themselves. As bones become mixed up, speaking subjects fail to disentangle themselves from the objects of their address. The confusion is reflected in the conversation's transcription, where Miss Blank becomes Mrs. Blank, and speech emerges apart and indistinguishable from any recognizable speaker. It's likewise notable that this remains one of the only scenes in the early letters where Mr. Twain names himself in the third person, engraving authorial presence in this messy moment where landscapes, voices, bones, and bodies are confused, overlapped, and entangled. Twain never does explain the unburied mass of bones which his traveling party stumbled upon that evening in 1866, but he does hint at some underlying possibilities. Rejecting Jarvis's official history of an imperial battle in the Nu'uanu Valley, Twain speculates on a recent pestilence, unearthing counter-narratives of genocide, which, through a series of colonial diseases, including bubonic plague, influenza, whooping cough, mumps, leprosy, smallpox, diphtheria, and cholera, would reduce the native population from an estimated 1 million persons prior to the 1778 arrival of James Cook to less than 40,000 Hawaiian inhabitants upon the overthrow of the kingdom in 1893. This subaltern history, however, is undercut by Twain's defense of his party's theft, arguing that it was better to take the bones than, quote, to permit those remains to lie decade after decade, to bleach and rot in the sun and the wind, and suffer desecration by careless strangers and by the beasts of the field, unprotected by even a worm fence. This important final passage offers a unique re-envisioning of certain ecological forces, weather patterns, organic decomposition, solar bleaching, which rather than invite decolonial imagining, become the very justification for the party's encroachment. While Twain ends this moonlit colonial encounter with the same elusiveness as his later volcanic descent, meditations on transcorporeality continue to haunt the journalist's subsequent letters. When describing Sunday activities in urban Honolulu, Twain marks a time in the evening when European residents seek shelter indoors and the Hawaiian women dance the lascivious hula hula, a dance that is said to exhibit the very perfection of educated motion of limb and arm, hand and head and body, and the exactest uniformity of movement and accuracy of time. It was performed by a circle of girls with no raiment on them, so to speak of, who went through with an infinite variety of motions and figures without prompting, and yet so true was their time, and in such perfect concert did they move, that when they were placed in a straight line, hands, arms, bodies, limbs, and heads waved, swayed, gesticulated, bowed, stooped, whirled, squirmed, twisted, and undulated, as if they were part and parcel of a single individual. And it was difficult to believe they were not moved in a body by some exquisite piece of mechanism. As in many white colonial travel narratives of the 19th century, these lascivious dancers are sexualized and exoticized by Twain's gaze. Yet rather than render them passive objects, the adjectives Twain uses to describe the dancers, educated motion, infinite variety, perfect concert, suggests an active and deeply informed practice that astounds and perplexes the correspondent. Additionally, this practice is linked to a complex interrelation of bodies that is simultaneously born from ecological knowledge traditions. As Hawaiian studies scholar Renee Pu'alani-Lois notes, hula remains one of the many practices by which, quote, Kanaka Hawaii still perceive themselves as an extension of nature and treat all natural and metaphysical elements as part of a sacred genealogical relationship. Unlike the traveling party of tourists who are unwittingly mixed up by the landscapes and bones over which they traverse, Twain observes these Hawaiian dancers in perfect concert with each other and their environs, bound by an accuracy of time. Twain's description of this circle of dancers generates important questions when read against many of the aforementioned passages about ecology. There is no stable panoramic vision, no contained picturesque landscape, nor is there dialogue, character construction, wit, or humor. There's only motion, continuous, enveloping, so overpowering that individual bodies can no longer be distinguished from one another. Twain's astonishment opened space to imagine alternative ways that bodies might relate to themselves and other bodies through a living, active epistemology, apart from the Cartesian duality of nature and culture, mind or body. And yet Twain likens this accuracy not to Hawaiian knowledge traditions, nor to organic rhythms drawn from place-based relations, but, quote, some exquisite piece of mechanism. Is Twain's mechanized imagery meant to equate the hula with Western industrial technologies? Is the writer further entangling the biological and the historical, the social narrative of the human and its built environment with the corporeal temporality of the body and its inhabited ecologies? While these questions remain unanswered, Twain's astonishment, I argue, offers us a slight glimpse of competing knowledge traditions in Hawaii, referencing hula beyond its commonly reduced representation as a tourist spectacle to to reveal different relations to time, history, body, and land. Ultimately, these poetics of Twain's specific ecologies offer neither a stable nor uniform story of conventional colonial complicity, nor a liberating practice of resistance and opposition, but rather reflect the ambivalence of a 19th century white American writer whose relationship to imperial economies of global commerce and transnational routes of travel remained ambiguous and uncertain. It's through these neglected and oftentimes under-considered writings about non-human ecologies and environmental landscapes where we best see Twain's ambivalence, welcoming us into a renewed study of an author no longer marked by his conclusive witticisms or determined aphorisms, enticing us to locate the valleys, harbors, and craters where he most certainly saw room for the imagination to work, and where we might conversely see the Aina underwriting his complicated and ever-shifting ethics of entangled social and ecological history. In 1897, while traveling by rail car across the Indian countryside, and this is a passage from Following the Equator, so this is a very, very late Twain coming after very early Twain revealed his secret to writing about non-human environments. He writes, "All day long, one has this monotony of dust-colored dead levels and scattering bunches of trees and mud villages. You soon realize that India is not beautiful. Still, there is an enchantment about it that is beguiling, and which does not pall. You cannot tell just what it is that makes the spell, perhaps, but you feel it and confess it nevertheless. Of course, at bottom you know in a vague way that it is history. It is that affects you. A haunting sense of the myriads of human lives that have blossomed and withered and perished here, repeating century after century and age after age the barren and meaningless process. It is this sense that gives to this forlorn, uncomely land power to speak to the spirit and make friends with it, to speak with it with a voice bitter with satire, but eloquent with melancholy. The deserts of Australia and the ice barrens of Greenland have no speech, for they have no venerable history, with nothing to tell of man and his vanities, his fleeting glories and his miseries. They have nothing wherewith to spiritualize their ugliness and veil it with a charm." And I paired this late passage from Twain with, and we'll move on to another discussion here in a second, with a contemporary work of art by Drew Kahuaina Broderick, and it's called Billboard One. And the subtitle of the piece is the phrase with which you're now familiar: "The sovereignty of the land is perpetuated in righteousness." And it's in response to historical artwork by the 18th century painter George Carter entitled "The Death of Captain Cook." And so Broderick was able to receive permissions from the Bishop Museum to photograph and digitally manipulate and reproduce the painting as a billboard. But only under the condition that he destroyed the work after he was done with it, because the Bishop Museum still owned the rights to the painting, and he had to document that destruction. So I'll show you that on the next slide. Twain's later assuredness that history, and specifically human history, is the primary element necessary in spiritualizing the ugliness of non-human nature, is interesting when contrasted with these earlier letters, where nature serves as a site for the erasure or the evaporation of human folly. Consider Twain's historical India alongside this 1866 depiction of a colonial marker, now obscured by non-human ecologies, a monument to Captain James Cook, which Twain and his companion Mr. Brown first encountered outside Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii as they walked through a densely clad forest jungle and, quote, "Up on the mountainside, we had passed by a large enclosure like an ample hog pen, built of lava blocks, which marks the spot where Cook's flesh was stripped from his bones and burned. But this is not properly a monument, since it was erected by the natives themselves, and less to do to honor the circumnavigator than for the sake of convenience in roasting. A thing like a guide board was elevated above this pen on a tall pole, and formerly there was an inscription upon it describing the memorable occurrence that had there taken place. But the sun and the wind have long ago so defaced it as to render it illegible." Unlike the bones that Twain's entourage displaced in order to preserve from environmental change, In this passage, we see a monument of erasure, where non-human nature holds the power to temporarily deface, render illegible. We are not in Twain's India, where the landscape is informed and subsequently enhanced by human history's underwriting. Rather, upon the mountainsides above Kealakekua Bay, we witness non-human ecologies working to rebuild, if not repair, the losses sustained by colonial violence. It's perhaps no coincidence that this passage references a colonizer from whom Twain worked at pains to distinguish himself, both directly in these early letters, as well as thematically in his later, more cogent articulations of anti-imperial consciousness. While I would certainly not cite such early writings as evidence of decolonial awareness, these ever-defacing, oftentimes incoherent ecological monuments offer space to meditate on the complicated and conflicting politics of an American writer usually confined to the accuracies of his literary realism. Twain's poetic meditations on non-human ecosystems beyond mere word paintings, designed to impress a highbrow literary audience, offer complex dynamic space for the young correspondent's uncertainties about Americans' imperial investments, which could not be contained by writing on any one particular side of the illusory nature-culture divide. Such early readings of these ambivalent musings might encourage us to further consider Twain's depictions of flora and fauna throughout his subsequent literary canon, looking across Mississippi River basins, New York farmlands, and southwestern desertscapes for a more complicated engagement with the author's ever-developing political ethics. But they also ask us to consider the importance of Mark Twain apart from the historical relevance of his literature. To consider Mark Twain within the existential crises posed by our shared Anthropocene requires that we look beyond the archives and artifacts of our colonized world and consider all that lives independent of these landscapes of human history. I'll conclude then with a reference to a creative act of Mark Twain's, which continues to live, however ambivalently, beyond the boundaries of a written text. In 1866, when visiting the small community of Waiohinu, Samuel Clemens supposedly planted the seeds of what would become one of Hawaii's most well-known monkeypod trees. The seeds sprouted, rooted, trunked, and continued to grow, marking the center of Waiohinu's human community. In 1888, a Calvinist missionary group built a church directly next to Clemens' monkeypod. A 1959 storm blew the tree down, but a group of local community members replanted the clippings, revitalizing the monkeypod's second life. The church also disappeared, destroyed by an infestation of termites in 1998. Now only the monkeypod remains, once divorced from Clemens' original planting, surviving nonetheless. Like the poetic musings which often distracted the writer from his intended conclusions, Clemens' monkeypod cannot be read on one side of a colonial divide that would separate non-human nature from cultural history. The tree is both an autonomous, organic life, and simultaneously a historical marker and a tourist attraction. It's an act of eco-social stewardship and also colonial alteration. The monkeypod tree, while an iconic part of the post-colonial Hawaiian landscape, is neither indigenous nor a Polynesian introduced species, but arrived from Central and South America on a route opposite Twain's. It designates human property and recalls the historical figure presumably planted it, and yet it thrives beyond and apart from that life and that community. Ultimately, it remains in the center of Waiohinu town, alongside the ever-expanding revelations of Twain scholarship, a creative act that stands apart, but not entirely disentangled from the writer's textual proliferations and political uncertainties, asking us to consider the unspoken ecological complexity of an American writer, traveler, historian, and humorist who is anything but silent. Thank you.